Well, the Western media has been playing a game of Twister over the past few days, trying to put itself in pretzels, trying to describe the African summit, which has just taken place in St. Petersburg, Russia. From headlines like this from NBC News, Putin searches for more friends at Africa's summit. Here's another one. Africa, beware of Putin's money. And my favorite from Time Magazine, why African leaders are staying away from Putin's Africa summit and how things have not gone as planned. So just read any Western media accounting of this, and it was a total disaster for Russia, and it was a total disaster for Africa. Independent journalist Mike Jones from Earl Grey was there on the scene in St. Petersburg and has been covering this, doing great reporting and a number of interviews with African leaders and journalists as well, and getting a sense of what's been happening in St. Petersburg. And he joins us now. Mike, great to have you back on Redacted. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you for having me. Yes, it was quite an event.
So a lot of moving pieces and a lot of different headlines that I think the Western media has ignored. Why don't we start with, I think, one of the biggest messages we've heard over the past year from Africa, which is the idea of African sovereignty. Like, the West has pilfered resources, the United States specifically, has pilfered resources from African nations for many, many years under the threat of the U.S. dollar and military might and building military bases. So this seemed to be a pretty big message coming out of this summit, which is you get to keep your own sovereignty. We don't want to take your sovereignty. Can you elaborate on that?
Certainly. I will zone in on President Putin's own words, where he assured African nations that Russia would support them in what he said was protecting their own sovereignty. This has come in many forms. We've seen a string of coups and meddling and such activity from the US, not to mention Victoria Nuland scurrying to South Africa very recently. So we see the signs from the US there. So I think from President Putin, that was an assurance to the leaders. CBS News ran with the headline that just 17 heads of state from Africa attended the Russia-Africa summit, which was half of those that attended the previous one. What CBS failed to mention was that 32 other countries were represented by high-level officials, including ambassadors, making that total 49 out of 54 African countries, despite the threat of US sanctions, which is a clear signal, and understandable why CBS chose to overlook that little detail there.
It's funny how they spin this, right? But yeah, because the Western media painting this as a failure. But of course, all of these African leaders and African ambassadors in St. Petersburg for this. Someone else who was in St. Petersburg, and the Western media did pick up on this. I saw different reports about the former head of the Wagner group, Prigozhin, was in St. Petersburg as a bit of a surprise, I think, and Western media picking up saying, what's going on here is, does Putin have an adversary or an ally? What's going on in St. Petersburg with Prigozhin? What did you make of his appearance?
I saw that as underpinning and underlining Putin's message of Russia will support you. Wagner has very positive sentiment towards it on the African continent. Wagner has been instrumental in fighting off the French military, as they have supplied, financed, and supported terrorist organizations in various countries under their former colonial power, not to mention the US. And of course, I would be remiss to omit the British influence as well on that continent as well. So far from being subjected to exile in Belarus, St. Petersburg, which was traditionally Prigozhin's headquarters of both his activities and Wagner in particular, I believe that the West was actually right to pick up on his presence. I detected a sense of alarm almost in some of those headlines, because Yevgeny Prigozhin is no doubt very familiar with many of these heads of state and officials that were represented there, and on very good terms with them. It seemed to be from the pictures that even the Western media presented. So I detect a lot of alarm in these countries, whereby they are actually very concerned that they're losing their grip, and the threat and fear and bully tactics that they've employed to date, that actually not just Putin's words, but there are sort of teeth to back them up.
Well, the Western press, Western leaders would say that Africa is falling out of favor, or Russia is falling out of favor with many African countries But we see a number of coups in Africa to kind of speak to the French influence in Africa that really goes against that narrative. Can you explain more about, we saw the coups in Niger, Burkina Faso. Am I missing any other ones? But it seems that this is a denunciation of Western policies more than anything.
Yeah, I believe Sudan was another one. Again, I could be wrong there. I struggle and lose track. I've spoken with a general from Somalia, a journalist today from Ghana, who tell me that opposite to the Western narrative, that there is rising support and sentiment in the African continent. We've had Uganda recently enact laws that go against the LGBT narrative or push there, where they're trying to protect the traditional values that Russia tries to uphold. So there's a lot of key alliances and opinion there. And the African people, from their own words, the African officials that toe the US line are most generally the corrupted ones. They've been visited by the economic hitman or the IMF, and they've sold out the interests of their people. Whereas, and this is going back to the times of the Soviet Union, Russia doesn't exert influence so much as offers cooperation and partnership as investment. And we've seen that evidenced by Putin forgiving $23 billion of debt. I've never heard of such an action taken by the IMF, by the West, in my lifetime, for sure. Now, I could be wrong, of course, but this was pretty monumental and made the headlines most certainly in Russian media. I'm not sure how much the West picked up on that.
I didn't see those headlines in any Western press that Russia forgives the debt of certain African nations and the billions that they've done. You bring up a great point about the IMF. This is something we've talked at length about on our show, which is the International Monetary Fund. It keeps these nations in debt in perpetuity, right? And it really prohibits their ability to ever get out from underneath that, to create economic prosperity. Because in order to survive, they need to continue to take this money from the International Monetary Fund. And it's really just a tragic situation. The same thing was happening in Ukraine, by the way, right? Think about the amount of loans that the IMF is having to deal with and dole out to Ukraine, which will be a country that will be in absolute debt for decades to come, what's left of it. So it's a very important story.
Absolutely. And you're absolutely right, both to mention the word tragic and Ukraine. It is an absolute tragedy with Ukraine. That's always been my thought, because these are not gifts. It's not charity. These are loans. These are lend-lease. How are the Ukrainian people that are left there? And that's another headline where they're trying to call for Ukrainians to return home. How are they supposed to pay off this debt? I don't foresee Monsanto walking away from the land that they've purchased for pennies, pittance in there, along with BlackRock, Vanguard, and all the other interests that have, in accordance with the IMF sort of modus operandi, moved in on a country, taken its sovereign wealth, taken away the natural resources. I'll stress that I'd really like to, I've forgotten the political analysts that delivered this, but they said that Africa is not a poor continent. It has been made poor by the colonial powers in the US. It is one of the richest continents on the planet. And I believe Russia and indeed China recognize this, hence why they are proposing trade and partnership and trying to help them. Whereas to date, and for hundreds of years, let's be absolutely frank, the West has pillaged this continent. Putin also stressed that Africa is one of the poles in the new multipolar world. And I've not read that in the Western media, but I think this is why we're seeing almost a seismic tectonic shift on the geopolitical sphere, as this is being said out loud, recognized, and even encouraged and upheld.
It's interesting. We heard the Zimbabwe delegation a couple of months ago saying the same, which is we have other friends. We don't need to have just our resources pilfered by the West. We have other options now to both settle our transactions in other currency, also to have other allies and support. And we are seeing a major shift. I believe we are seeing this tipping point unfolding right before our eyes. One thing I want to get you out of here on this, Mike, which is the grain deal. And you had some really fascinating information that you were able to report on as it related to the grain deal. Of course, the Western media was saying basically, the Western leaders are saying that Russia was not allowing these ships to leave. Russia was denying that. And you've managed to bring forward some proof on that. Can you talk about this grain deal and what you've uncovered?
Absolutely. I will also add that the grain deal featured as one of Putin's speeches, where he assured 6 African nations that not only would they receive 25 to 50,000 tons of grain free of charge, but also the delivery of which free of charge. He went on to list them, and I'll save people the details now. They can find that out of these. I think one of the reasons that he stressed this was part of the original grain deal. The UN even claimed that there would be a famine in Africa if Russia did not go along with the grain deal, the UN-backed grain deal brokered in Turkey. It was reported by Maria Zakharova that just one tanker out of hundreds made it to the African continent, the rest going to Europe to be sold for profits. With the withdrawal of Russia from the grain deal, a lot of criticism was leveled, saying that, Africa's going to starve. So I believe to assuage this, Putin has assured the African continent that no, your needs will be met, and he outlined the terms of that deal. We know that Russia has pulled out following the attack on the Kerch Bridge. From what I'm told in my interview with Andrei Afanasyev, he showed me, or you could say receipts, but these are documents supplied to him by Ukrainian supporters of his work. He's a military journalist currently in Donetsk, which is why my interview with him was a bit ad hoc and on Telegram, where he shows these PDFs that show the ships, the origin and the destination and the cargo and the flag they were flying, many of whom are Ukrainian. So he claims that this is proof that Russia upheld its part of the grain deal, where it permitted safe passage for these ships to and from. He then levels the allegation that the West, saying that Russia broke its part of the agreement, holds no water, because then Ukraine went on to attack the Crimean Bridge, killing 2 civilians and indeed civilian infrastructure. President Putin stressed at the time that the Crimean Bridge has not been used for military logistics for a long time. Russia does not depend on it to supply its southern armies in the area of the Donbass. So this was, in his opinion, President Putin's civilian infrastructure, and therefore that was a breach of the grain deal. That we go on to then the stories that the FSB claim to have found traces of explosives, so that the ships being used by Ukraine under the grain deal were actually smuggling weapons, according to the Russian media and the justification from Russia from withdrawing. So Andrei has supplied those PDFs. They are in Ukrainian, but it's very clear to see where they're coming from, and you're very welcome to share them with the audience so they can scrutinize them themselves.
Fascinating. Well, I guess the Western media narrative continues to crumble, but thanks to great independent journalist reporting from Mike and others. Thank you so much, Mike. This is great. This is a great summation of what we saw at this summit in Africa, in St. Petersburg, the African summit there. And it'll be interesting to see if other nations, other Western nations, come forward, and if they purport to support Africa, maybe they will also alleviate some of this debt burden that is crushing that continent. Mike, great to see you. Thank you so much for this.
Thank you for having me. A pleasure.
I should point out too that in the Donbass, where Mike was, heading into Donetsk. I mean, we talk about the attacks on Moscow overnight, but the unbelievable attacks over the past 24 hours in the Donbass in Donetsk has been absolutely horrific. Again, more civilians killed, and just an awful situation there once again. So I see some people in the chat asking about that. And yeah, absolutely. That's been happening in the Donbass over the past 24 hours. Once again, attack on civilian infrastructure, and no military targets whatsoever. You're hitting residential areas. You're hitting, you're hitting apartment complexes. You're hitting buses. You're hitting train stations. You're not hitting military targets at all.
Right. Yeah. Well, I really appreciate that, especially as the West continues to up its rhetoric about how Africa doesn't understand what they're doing, getting themselves into all this debt with Russia and China. They don't understand the numbers. Only us in the West understand the numbers. I mean, talk about racism, right?
Yeah.
And so watching an entire continent saying, we do, we know what we're doing. Thanks for that, though. It's definitely something to watch. So coming up, we're going to talk about Julian Assange and what the West is doing about continuing to persecute him in the name of journalism. We're going to talk about how Australia has sort of woken up, realized he exists. Not that it's going to do much, but let me know what you think when we get to that story. We're also going to cover the Facebook files, how we continue to be censored online. I know you're shocked, but we can't get bored of this story. As much as we see these now, I feel like we've been watching this for about 6 months. Twitter files, Facebook files, we continue to see proof that the federal government reached into social media to decide what we could say and how we can say it. Also, how we could joke about it even. We're going to show you how memes were intended to be censored. We can't fall asleep on this story because it will continue to happen. It's not supposed to be happening right now. But anyhow, we're going to get to that in a bit.
Okay. And I got a few super chats we want to get to. Andy Taylor, thank you for your super chat. I'm 100% certain Ukraine, they're hitting these targets with missile defense. They know their own missile trajectories and the risks before launch. And Jamila Asfu says the West don't like Africa, but they won't leave us alone. Yeah, that's right. And when you see, I saw a map today. I saw a map today of Africa and just like looking at, and it just showed the massive continent of Africa. And it just had every one of the countries was renamed as a different resource and mineral. It was like uranium, like instead of Uganda, it was, all of these different countries were just renamed minerals, which is exactly why the West, I'm just looking at what's happening in Niger right now. Exactly that reason. Andy Taylor says, girl in Moscow, mommy dudes like, yo, explosion. Let's check it out before those two guys and more volunteers go to fight NATO Ukraine terrorists now. Brett Green, love these folks. Thank you, Brett. Appreciate it. The Laterix, thank you for your super chat. Gigi, and another one from Laterix there. And IB Mickelson, thank you so much for your kind super chats as well. Darren Michael Bennett, thank you so much. And if you guys subscribe to the channel live during the show here, your name will pop up on the big board. So if you do subscribe or you can become a Redacted Rebel VIP, your name will pop up here on the big board. And also, if you're watching us on Rumble, the same thing. It's very easy on Rumble. There's a big red button. You can join our locals community. If you'd like to support independent journalism, you can do that. All right, we've got more news to get to. We're going to get to this Julian Assange story next because I think it's a big, very, very important story. And it really... it really speaks to the future of what journalism is and will be. So we'll talk about that. Thank you so much for watching this segment here at Redacted. We are live every day at 4 p.m. Eastern time, trying to share the stories that the mainstream media will not cover. You should also come over and join our community of Redacted Rebels over at redacted.inc. That's our private locals community where we can share exclusive content that we simply cannot share here on YouTube. Come over and join the rebellion together right now by going to redacted.inc. We'll see you next time.